Hello, Twitch chat. This is Rob. In this stream, which is my second stream, we're going to sort of fill in a couple gaps that were left in the previous stream, where we talked about using Azure Functions with SharePoint Framework Webparts and delegated authentication. So let's just switch over to my virtual machine here and just kind of review what we did last time, and then I'll talk about what we want to do this time. So in the previous stream, we created an Azure Function app here, and we used EasyAuth, or the Express authentication setup, to create an associated Azure AD app registration. And in that app registration, we created a client secret, which we're using, and we also both requested and granted a SharePoint permission, and that is the allsites.read permission. Because what we wanted to do was create an Azure function that enabled users to get list information from a specific site collection. So once we had that all set up, we then created the Azure function using Visual Studio 2019 in this case. You could also use Visual Studio 2017. Excuse me. So here's our Azure function, and we're using the on behalf of flow. So basically, our SharePoint Framework Webpart is going to send up a token, and then we're going to exchange that token for a token for the Azure AD app registration associated with the Azure function, so that we can then go and call into SharePoint. And all we're doing is we're getting the lists, the names of non-hidden lists inside of a site collection, which we've, in this case, hard-coded up here at the top. So that was our Azure function. We then published our Azure function up into the Azure Function app using just web deploy. And then we created the SharePoint Framework Webpart, which will consume that function. So up here, we're using the AAD HTTP client object to make the call off to the Azure function. We're getting the data back, and then all we do is just format the list information into, or the names of the list into an HTML unordered list, and inject that into the body of the web part. And what we end up with is something that looks like this. So that all worked fine, but there was a couple things that we kind of left hanging. So one was, how do we debug this local Azure function? So instead of having to publish it up to the Azure Function app, how do we debug it locally? And the second thing was, while this proved that the Azure function worked, it was able to get the list information, it didn't really demonstrate that we were using delegated authentication. Because when I go to this other user over here, I basically get the same information. It's, anybody who has access to the site collection can at least look at the lists. So it wasn't really demonstrating that we were properly using delegated authentication. So to address that, what I want to do is update both our Azure function and the SharePoint Framework Webpart to, instead of retrieving and displaying list information, we're instead going to retrieve and display user profile properties. So in this case, you can see that I'm logged in as Rob Windsor. And when I ask for the user profile information from the Azure function, it's coming back with profile information related to Rob Windsor. And in this browser window over here, I'm logged in as Patty Fernandez. And when I go and ask for her user profile property information, I get back information related to Patty Fernandez. So this does demonstrate that the delegated authentication is working as expected. We're querying into the SharePoint using the credentials of the currently logged in user. All right, so let's address those two things. So we'll start off with the debugging piece. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up Fiddler here, and this will allow me to capture information about the traffic between for my web service calls. And what I'm going to do is come over here to this Webpart, and I'm just going to refresh it. So you can see it's got the message that we're loading the list. It's calling the Azure function right now. I haven't called the Azure function in a bit, so it might have to do a cold start. That's why it's taking a second. And there's our list information. And then if we come back to Fiddler and scroll up a little bit, we should see there is the call that was made to get the list information. So we come over to the inspectors and take a look at the JSON returned, and we can see that we did get an array of strings with the list information. But that's not the important part in terms of the debugging. What's important is up here in the request information. So basically, if we take a look at the raw request, or even the headers are okay, what we'll see, and actually let me just open this up in Notepad so you can see a little bit easier, is that we got this authorization header with a bearer token or an access token. They're the same thing, right? So this is the token that's being sent from the SharePoint Framework Webpart to the Azure function. And it's the token we're going to exchange for the token for our Azure AD app. Okay? So to be able to test locally, we need this function. Sorry, we need this token. Because if we take a look at our Azure function, one of the things we do is we go and query the headers to get that authorization parameter, right? So at this point, when we have that, we can actually go ahead and debug our Azure function locally. So let me put a breakpoint here. And let me put a breakpoint here. And let me put one final breakpoint down here. And let me go ahead and just start a debugging session. So if you're not familiar with local development of Azure functions, what this will do is it'll start up a localhost and serve up our function there, and then we can make calls to localhost to get the to exercise the function. And there's the URL we need to use. So what I'm going to do is, first off, I'm going to go over to Fiddler, and I'm going to open up the Composer tab, and then I'm going to drag and drop our function call. Where was it? There it was there. Onto the Composer, right? And I want to just get rid of host there because we're not calling it from online. So I want to get rid of this refer here. And then what I'm going to do is come over to my window that's hosting our Azure function, and I'm going to copy that URL, which is our local URL here. And I'm going to replace this URL with the local one. Okay. And now I'm going to go ahead and execute the function call. And what we should see is now we've hit our breakpoint. Okay. So I'm now calling into the locally running Azure function that's being hosted and monitored by Visual Studio. And the first thing I want to do is just take a look at this impersonation token. So we can see it starts with EYJ0 or OE. Let me just grab that whole thing and copy it and put it into a notepad. I'll use that one. Okay. And then I will continue. Okay, now we've hit our second breakpoint. Now we have another token. It starts out with the same thing, but let's grab that and put it into Notepad as well. And I think I have another empty Notepad here. Oh, no, it's not that one. It is that one. Okay. So we get the 2 tokens. That's good. And let me close that. And then finally, let me continue again. And we should now have hit our 3rd breakpoint. And at this point, we can check and see what the list names are. And you can see that we have a string array, or actually in this case, a generic list with the actual list names. So that worked as expected. And then I can go ahead and continue here. And then I should be able to go and find that request. So there it is, localhost API get lists, and go to the inspectors, and there we can see the response that has the list names. So by making the request from the SharePoint Framework Webpart, we can then get the authorization header that has the token being passed from SharePoint Framework up to the Azure function. And that allows us to then complete the work, because the rest of it, which is getting the token for the Azure AD app and then calling the locally running function, can all be done locally. There's nothing special that needs to be done there. But let's take a second to examine these tokens. So I think I have this backwards. I think this was our first one here. Let me just grab this. And what this is a JOT token, or a JSON web token, which we can actually inspect. So there's several different ways to inspect a token. I'm going to use this site, which is jwt.io. Let me put that link in the chat. And what I can do is I can just go ahead and paste not jwt.io. That's ineffective. Let's come back to, I think it was here, and grab that token and paste it in here. And then we can actually see the JSON associated with the token. And the important part is, well, one, you can see that it has information about the current user, so that you can see Rob Windsor. And you can see my email address here, rob@robwindsortest986.onmicrosoft.com. But this one is the important one here, which is the scope. So this scope is user impersonation, right? One thing I didn't mention, but is important, and then we did this in the last stream, is if I come over to the SharePoint Admin Center, I granted my SharePoint Framework Webpart user impersonation permission on the Azure AD app associated with the Azure function, right? So that's the token that's going to get sent from the SharePoint Framework up to the Azure function through the Azure AD app. And then we're going to exchange that for the token to be able to go ahead and call into SharePoint. So that should be this token. So let me just grab that. Actually, let me try that again. Just make sure I got the whole thing. So Control A and then Control C. And come back over to our site where we can take a look at the token and just paste that in. And now we can see that we have a token, which same user information. The app is different. So this is our Azure AD app associated with the Azure function. And the scopes are different, or the scope in this case, which is allsites.read, which is the permission we requested to be able to go and talk to SharePoint through the client object model. And we can see that's the permission there, allsites.read. All right, so that was one thing I wanted to cover, was how we can go ahead and debug our locally running Azure function. And really the only thing that I just didn't think of in the last stream was using Fiddler to capture the authorization header that was going from the SharePoint framework up to Azure to be able to do that. All right, so that's step one. Now, step two is we want to modify our Azure function and our SharePoint Framework Webpart to, instead of showing list information, we want to show user profile information. So to be able to do that, I'm going to have to request another permission. So let me go ahead and click in. This is the Azure function app registration. So I'm going to click add permission here. And I want a SharePoint permission. And I want a delegated permission because we're demonstrating delegated authentication. And then under user, I'll click user.read.all. So I want this app to be able to read user profiles from any user within my tenant. Okay. So I'll go ahead and click add permission. Now again, remember this is just requesting permission. This is just requesting the permission for the app, right? So in this case, because it's delegated permissions, both the app and the current user need to have permissions to be able to do any process. So if the current user, if the app is trying to read permissions from SharePoint that the current user does not have access to, that request will fail because, again, both the app and the user have to have the appropriate permission for the request to succeed. So I'm going to go ahead and click add permission here. And you can see that this has not been granted. So what I'm going to do is the same thing I did in the last stream. I'm going to, as the tenant administrator, I'm going to grant consent for that permission request for all users. So I'm going to sign in as the tenant admin. You could also be the SharePoint admin in this case. That would work fine. And you can see I'm accepting for my organization here. So click accept. And in a moment, this should pop up saying that our new permission request has been granted for people in my Rob Windsor test 986 tenant. All right. So while we're waiting for that, we can come back over to our Azure function that we've got in Visual Studio. And let me just remove those breakpoints. And we're going to create a second Azure function to get the user profile information. So I'm going to right-click on my project and choose Add Azure Function. I'm going to call the function Get User Profile. This is going to be triggered by an HTTP request. I'll set it's anonymous. Not meaning that the call is anonymous. It's actually going to be secured by Azure AD, but the Azure function infrastructure isn't going to do anything around access rights. And I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, just like with our get lists function, I'm going to still need to authenticate with Azure AD. And I don't really want to duplicate all this code. So let's also create a class where we can centralize the code to get the access token and then call it from both of the different functions. So I'm going to right-click here and choose Add Class. We'll call this class Token Helper. And I want to make sure this is both public and static. So public static class token helper. And we'll add in one method, which is to get the access token. So that will be public async static. Well, for right now, I'll just say string. It won't be a string, but and then it's called get token. Okay, now this is an async method, so I can't just return a string. I need to return a task of string. Okay, so there is our function shell, and then we can come over to get lists. And I don't want tenant name to be hard-coded, so I think from here down is where I'll copy to there. Actually, let me just cut that to the clipboard and come over here and paste it in. Okay, so first off, we just need to resolve some type names here. So that's cool. The impersonation token is going to need to be a parameter. So that's one, and the tenant name is going to be a parameter. So let's go ahead and do this. So I'll say here string tenant name, and string, and impersonation token. Okay, so and then I'll get rid of this here. And I guess the last thing we need to do is actually return the token. And that should be good now. Okay. So now that we have that method, I can come over to get lists. And I should be able to say here, oh, I need the code to get the impersonation token. So let me just come back over here. It was this one right here. So let me just grab that. Come back over here and paste that in. There. Okay, and then I just need to re-add the return. All right, so now I should be able to say here var token is equal to await token helper dot get token. I need to pass in the tenant name and the impersonation token. Okay, so that should be cool. Whoops, I need, yep, actually I've got everything there. So now we have our get user profile function. So now I'll go ahead and copy everything in here, the get list function, over to get user profile. And I do again need to make sure that I have the appropriate using statements. So let me go ahead and add those. And what we want to do now is we want to get the user profile information rather than the list information. So this is all to do with lists. So let me go ahead and delete that. And let me go ahead and delete that. And I have some code that is from my Pluralsight course on the Client Object Model and REST API, which I'm just going to grab here. And we're going to paste that in and use that as kind of the starting point for the code to get the user profile. All right, so we're going to use the people manager, and I'm going to need to resolve or add the appropriate using statement for that. And this is not a web forms project, so I don't have the result list box. So we can get rid of that. But what I want to do is get the properties for the current user. So from the people manager, I can call the get my properties method. And then the important thing I want to load is the user profile properties. Now, this is a set of key value pairs. So we're going to iterate over the keys that get returned. And then we're going to get the value associated with the key. And if there is a value, so if it's non-null or non-empty string, then we want to add that to our properties. So there's a few different ways we can store this data. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a dynamic object. So I'll say here dynamic profile properties is equal to a new J object. So this is using Newtonsoft JSON. J object. And then what I can go ahead and do is populate the properties of the J object. And I think I just need to add the using statement for Newtonsoft JSON. Oh, no. Using, Newtonsoft JSON link here. I didn't type J object correctly. That's why it wasn't coming up immediately. So then I'm going to populate the properties of the J object. So all I'll do down here is I'll say that profile properties at key, so we'll add a new property for the key, is equal to value. Okay, so we're going to add basically a new property to the object. And then down here, when I want to serialize this, I actually don't need to do serialization. I just need to do a toString because that's a Newtonsoft JSON object. It will automatically go to JSON. So it's just profile properties dot toString. All right, so that should be everything we need there, although we do have a squiggly here. The name profile properties does not exist in the current context. Let me do a build. Build. Oh, that's because it's outside of the using statement. Sorry, let me take this and move it up top here. There we go. Now that should work. Okay, cool. All right, so that is, now we've got the new function inside of our Azure Function project. So now again, we can go ahead and test this out. So I'll put a breakpoint here. And let me start up Fiddler again. And come over to our Webpart and refresh it. Come back to Fiddler, find that call. There it is there. Come over to the composer. Stop this from scrolling. There's our call. Drag and drop that there. Come back to our Azure Function project. Start up a debug session. Okay, and then go ahead and grab the URL to our get user profile function. Come back to Fiddler and get rid of that and get rid of this and change the URL. And I did set a breakpoint, right? Yes, I did. Okay, and then come back to Fiddler. Go ahead and execute. So we should hit our breakpoint. There we go. And then we should be able to just check the profile properties. Yep, we can see that that has been populated correctly. So I can go ahead and continue here. And let's come back to Fiddler. Find that request. Get user profile. There it is there. Go to the inspectors and JSON, and there we can see the property information. These are profile property information being sent back. So we can see, let's see, the important things here. Well, there's preferred name, Rob Windsor. That's something that we actually care about. First name and last name. Email. So username has email there or work email. Either one of those would be fine. Now, there's a lot of stuff here that, I mean, it might be valuable, but for the purposes of our demo web part, aren't really super valuable. So let's go ahead and modify our Azure function code just a little bit here. So let's come back to here. Let's stop debugging. And I'm not going to make you watch me type all this stuff out. I'm just going to change the for loop a little bit. So let's do it this way. What I'll do is I'll say that the only property names I care about are first name, last name, preferred name, and username. So, and I just have the different variable name here, so let me just change that to that. So basically I'll say that if the key isn't in one of these four values, then just continue through the loop. Or I could modify the code up here, but it doesn't really matter. The important thing is just want to get a subset of the actual profile properties that will end up showing in our SharePoint Framework Webpart. So let's go ahead and just save that off and run our function again. And then we can come back to Fiddler. We can go to the composer. We can just run the last function, and actually it's still there in the composer. So let's go ahead and execute that again. And that should hit breakpoint in our debugger. And there we can see the subset of user profile properties. Click continue here. Come back over to Fiddler. Find that request. I believe it's that one. Go to the inspectors, and there we can see just the subset coming back. Okay, so now we've got our Azure function behaving the way we want it to. So we can go ahead and close Fiddler and remove that breakpoint there. Stop the debugging session. And publish our updated Azure function up to the Azure function app. So I'll right click, I'll choose publish, and then go ahead and use web deploy to do that. And while that's happening, we can go ahead and take a look at our SharePoint Framework Webpart. So at this point, we don't want to call get list, we want to call get user profile. So I'll just change that. So now when we get to here, if there was no error, the result object will not be an array of strings. It's just going to be an object. And what we want to do is we want to iterate over the properties of that object to then show them in the web part. So I'll change list names to, I'll just type over it here, property names. Actually, let me just do a rename. So I'll right click and say rename symbol, and we'll say this is property names, which will be an array of string. And the way we'll get the property names is we will use object.keys, and then we'll pass in the object. So that will be the result object. Okay, so that'll give us the name of all of the properties of that object. Okay, and then we'll have here property names HTML. So let me just change that. So rename symbol and change list to property. So if there are no properties on the object, then we should say no profile properties returned. Otherwise, we want to iterate over the array of property names, and we want to create list items that have the value associated with that property name. So that would be result, and actually, well, I'll say result here at key, and then the parameter here should be key. Okay, so this is going to be an array of the keys or the property names. So we're going to iterate over those and get the values associated with those keys and join them together inside the unordered list. Okay, so now what we should be, what we're going to do is we're going to show the user profile information inside of the web part. A couple other things here. In our loading indicator, we're no longer loading lists. We're loading user profile properties. And here we're not showing lists, we're showing user profile properties. Go ahead and save that off. And let's go ahead and test this. So over here in my console window, I'll say gulp serve -- no browser to start up our hosting. Without loading the local workbench. We want to test this in the hosted workbench. So we'll wait till that gets to the reload task. That's when we know it's finished. That should be coming up soon. So now I can come over to here. Let's just go ahead and duplicate this tab. And I can load up the local workbench. And then I can add our Webpart to that. This Azure function app test 008. So that's good. We're loading user profile properties. And hopefully in a couple of seconds, we'll actually see the profile properties. I did a publish, yep. Let's come back over here and refresh this just to make sure our get user profile function is there. It should be. It is. Okay, let's come back over here. Let's see if we type something wrong. Maybe it's there. There's a console error. Oh, syntax error. Unexpected end of JSON result. Okay. Well, that was unexpected. So let's come back here and see if I've done something wrong. Get user profile. And property names is an array of string. Okay, let's start up Fiddler here. And then let's go ahead and Control F5. Oh, type in the wrong. There we go, Control F5. Do a hard refresh. Okay, oh, there we go, we got an issue. Get user profile. Raw response. Not found. API get user profile. Get user profile. Okay. I don't think I typed anything wrong. Oh, here we go. Is the function type name get user profile is invalid. Well, that is not cool. Okay, let's go ahead and copy that. And just come over here to one of our notepads and paste it in. Okay, let's try this. See if I can figure out what's going on here. Let's just republish. One of the settings here is, once those console windows go away, you can see here I have delete existing files. So basically every time this publishes, it deletes the existing files in the Azure app, Azure Function app, and replaces them. So, and I'm going to have an issue. I can't publish when Fiddler is running. So let's just do that and wait for this to complete. I don't think I had Fiddler running when it was publishing last time, so that shouldn't be the problem. You can see here it's just doing a retry. Now it's continuing to do the publish. Okay. So let's come back over to Azure here. And let's go home, all resources, Azure Function App Test 008. Okay, there are two functions, get lists. Okay, and no issues when I clicked on that. Now we have get user profile. And it is still giving the error. The function type name get user profile is invalid. Oh, I probably just did something stupid here with copy and paste. The function name is get user profile. No, I still didn't do anything there. Okay, this is weird. Let's try one more thing here. Right click, add, new Azure function, get user profile 2. And click add. HTTP trigger, anonymous, okay. Get user profile 2. All right, now let's go and grab this code here. And copy and paste it into here. Save. Let's do a build. Oh, no, it's not going to build because I didn't do the types. So let's go ahead and fix that. Okay, now let's do a build. All right, now let's do a publish. Okay, and let's come back over to Azure, all resources, Azure Function App Test 008. Get user profile 2. All right, that doesn't seem to have an issue. And now get user profile doesn't seem to have an issue. So let us come over here, do Control F5. And there we go. So I'm not exactly sure what caused that initial glitch in the deployment up to the Azure Function app. That's something I haven't seen previously. But now you can see that I was calling the original function. I didn't call the get user profile 2 function. I just called the get user profile. And we can see we're getting our user profile properties as expected. So now let's go ahead and publish. So I'll just stop the SharePoint Framework debug session. And I'll say here, gulp bundle -- ship to create the bundle. Again, that contains the JavaScript, the JavaScript that was transpiled from the TypeScript, along with CSS, any other static files, and manifest information. And then once that's finished, we'll go ahead and do the package solution to create the actual app package. So that's done. So now it's gulp package solution ship. That creates the actual app package, which we deploy up to the app catalog. That's done now, so I can come over to my app catalog. I can choose upload, choose files, Azure Function App Test 008. Click OK and OK. and deploy. And again, just because I'm very particular about keeping things clean here, I'm just going to do a check-in on the app package. Click OK. And now finally, if we come over to Azure Function App Test, the actual web part that's hosted in the site page, and refresh, now instead of seeing list information, we should see the user profile properties. And if we do the same thing over here in Patty's browser window, we should see the user profile properties for Patty. And there we do. All right, so that's really what I wanted to show here in this stream. There was just a couple loose ends that I left in the last one I wanted to tie up. So those two were debugging the locally running Azure function in Visual Studio, and the second was making it much more clear that when we were actually using delegated authentication through the Azure AD app, registration associated with our actual Azure function. So I didn't see any questions in the chat, so I'll just finish up here. Thank you very much. I will be publishing this video, so I'll download the video from Twitch and publish it up to my YouTube channel. It'll also be available in as video on demand on the Twitch for the next 14 days, so you can watch it there as well. And if you have any questions, let me just switch over to my MaxCam stream scene here. You can contact me through Twitter. There's also the link to my YouTube channel there, but Twitter is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. And I'd be happy to hear any feedback you have about the streams or any questions you might have on this particular session. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and have a great day. Bye now.